Hi, folks. So, for this week, we're going to be looking at drag, camp, and belonging, queer and trans subcultures. So, we'll be continuing our conversation from last week around the relationship between queer and trans people and community and space or place, as well as looking at some of the more internal conversations around gender within queer and trans scenes, particularly in relationship to drag. So we're looking at kind of this macro sense of queer space, larger dominant movements, social movements like gay liberation, which we'll be talking about today, and then some things more on the micro level, so the level of the body, and thinking about what is the role of camp in the creation and maintenance of drag styles, so different forms of drag, some of which you can see on this image here. And so thinking about the body as a place in relationship to gender performance. So we have an image here that I think very easily sums up some of the conversations around gender performativity that we had earlier, thinking about Judith Butler's work, Gender Trouble. And this idea that comes out of this image is you thinking about, is womanhood or femininity, is this something that is natural to anyone's body? Is this an inevitable form of embodiment for people who are assigned female at birth? Or is womanhood and femininity something that isn't necessarily hinged on a certain embodiment? We can kind of guess it's the latter, obviously. And so drag really allows us to think about gender in a different way. And then camp does as well, because camp tends to be associated with very effeminate or very high feminine aesthetics, a lot of very performative movements. So we're kind of thinking about, following this quote from RuPaul where they say, "You're all born naked and the rest is drag." So that's a very, it's not a very comprehensive understanding of gender, but I think it is a useful idea to keep in our minds around that gender isn't necessarily something that is inevitable, that it is something that is free flowing, that we can access in different ways. So for today, the lecture will be primarily on LGBTQ historiography. So as I said, continuing from last week, and specifically looking at the gay liberation movement, which kind of came out of a post-Stonewall riot, so in June 1969. And then we're going to take a few steps back and look at the Compton cafeteria riots, which happened 3 years before Stonewall, and is one of these under-researched, more unknown riots that preceded Stonewall. So we'll be thinking about gay liberation and how it impacted LGBTQ and drag cultures. And in terms of Stonewall, thinking about Group Three's text that we were assigned on the night they raided Stonewall, trying to think about queer historiography or the stories we tell about the Stonewall riots. So what is the role of Stonewall in a larger narrative of queer and trans history? Why is it the main thing we focus on? And what is the problem of queer memory in terms of how we talk about Stonewall insofar as who was there, and these discussions of, who threw the first rock, and thinking about queer cultural memory in terms of Stonewall. And on Friday, we'll be taking a closer look at camp and drag cultures. So particularly thinking about Group 2 and Group 2's chapter on camp and defining camp in relationship to drag. So we might think we know what camp is. Maybe we can see it when we notice it when we look at it, but we maybe don't know how to define it. So we can kind of think about camp as not just an aesthetic, but as a series of ideas, of looks, of literature, of associations. So the love of the unnatural, the ridiculous, theatrical movements, this idea of it's so bad, it's good, And it's often been historically associated with effeminate gay men, and also forms of irony that push back against dominant narratives of gay respectability. And on Friday, we'll do a review of the group readings, and also your group reading discussions on the Canvas page will be due at the end of the day. So you do have time after class to finish up any conversations, but they will be due at the end of the day, and then the pages will close so I can mark them. And on Friday, we'll also check in about the research creative project that's not coming for a few more weeks, but just kind of going over some ideas for what you can look at for your project. So, just a review of the readings for this week. So, I'm incorporating a mix of different ideas that we'll be looking at closer in later weeks. So, in the Shatina article, we do start to see conversations around drag race and the relationship between drag race and queer history. So on Friday, we'll be looking at this article closely and watching clips of the Snatch game from the show that are discussed in the article. David Valentine's work is a special review on Mother Camp. So Group A will be reading a chapter from Mother Camp, which is an ethnography by Esther Newton that came out in 1973. And it was the first ethnographic study of drag queens ever published within academia, and also one that was focused more on the community as opposed to talking about the community as pathological or as deviant. So for the group readings, I've assigned a variety of different texts that look at different concepts that we'll be exploring more. So as I said, chapter one from Mother Camp, the 1973 text by Esther Newton, Dolores McElroy's chapter on camp, which kind of breaks down the different forms of camp, examples of texts, examples of characters, examples of aesthetics. And Duberman and Kopkind article is just one example of the riots, of the Stonewall riots. So again, we'll be considering queer cultural memory, what it means to do interviews after the fact, and what is the place of Stonewall in queer and trans history in relationship to drag. And finally, the Boyd article, the Boyd chapter, that looks at trans and gay male cultures in the 1890s through the 1960s in San Francisco. So we've talked a bit about how San Francisco is this kind of unique history with certain forms of queer and trans spaces, particularly bars, that arose in a much earlier age than we commonly associate it with queer cultures. And so we'll look at some of the roles of trans and gay men within these nightclub spaces. So just to kind of break down some of these ideas that we'll be looking at this week. So we think of subcultures in relationship to a dominant culture. So a subculture can be a physical space, can be affects or emotions. So this idea that a space can have a meaning based on who is in the space, sexual cultures. So we talked about how a space can change based on who's using it. So, for instance, a park during the day will be a public space, whereas a park at night at some point could be a space for sexual encounters. So it's the same space, but has very different uses. So, queer cultures. So, we're thinking through this historical trajectory of queer cultures coming from a more underground, hidden um, context. So, bars that were frequently raided by police, the history of homosexuality being illegal, and then the slow movement towards certain forms of queer and trans, but mostly gay and lesbian mainstream activism and mainstream culture. So this kind of expansion of gay pride, where we see hundreds of thousands of people in a lot of major cities go to Pride, and you instead of having police kind of raiding queer spaces, now you have police walking in different pride parades. So we're looking at kind of um, the changes and also some of the cultural losses that have come with mainstreaming. And then also the influence on queer politics and drag. So, what is the relationship between a queer politic and drag? What can we learn from drag that can make us rethink our approaches to gender? And as I mentioned, drag aesthetics and camp. So, what is camp? The exuberant, the ridiculous, um, the kind of theatrical, as I mentioned, so bad it's good. And then also kind of paying attention to this notion of belonging. So belonging in a sense to a community and what it means to what it means to belong to a community, what kind of internal standards of inclusion or exclusion are happening, how are queer people connecting through language, and also different sexual practices that happen within those communities. So we'll take a very quick look at the shifting views of homosexuality. And particularly, I have a PSA from 1960, late 1950s, that kind of shows the broader cultural fear and anxiety around homosexuality, particularly in relationship to children. We'll be looking at from homophile to gay liberation and to lesbian feminism. So, again, these shifting forms of politics. We'll be taking a close look at Stonewall and the Compton cafeteria